Tong-Len, taking and sending. Tong-Len practice is perhaps the easiest and the most intuitive approach to meditation that I've come across, at least for Westerners. It was also the first practice that my teacher, Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche, pointed out to me many years ago, 30 years ago. I didn't think this fact was that important at the time, but now that I think about it, of course, Rinpoche knew exactly what he was doing. Trying to learn standard sitting meditation is much more difficult, at least it was for me. And with that in mind, let's look at Tong-Len, and I will try to go slow here. The great Tibetan Siddha, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, tells a story in his autobiography about watching some mean person beat a tiny puppy to death. Actually, I don't remember the exact details, but somehow Trungpa witnessed the death of this small animal and was deeply moved. It imprinted, it touched his heart. And for the rest of his life, so he writes, whenever he wanted to bring to mind the idea of compassion, he would think of this puppy and how it touched him. Now, the reason I mention this here is to point out to you that a good beginning target for Tong-Len practice is an experience like that, where your heart naturally goes out to a person or animal in a spontaneous way. Keep in mind that Tong-Len practice is all about breathing in something that moves you or causes you to react, either good or bad, taking that in with your breath, keeping it there, holding it, and then breathing back out toward the object with all the good energy that you can muster, sending your love, so to speak. And here's the thing. Tong-Len is always about duality, about you and something outside yourself that you either care about or don't like at all. And it's much easier to start with something that you love, an experience of compassion or real love that you hold dear, but you can also start with something you hate or something that you just can't stand. Most find it easier to work with something they love, something they feel natural compassion for, like Trungpa did with that puppy. But either way, you are examining a reaction that you have to something that you consider outside yourself. Tong-Len is always about resolving our dualities, our dualities with the world outside our skin. Actually, we might better say that Tong-Len is about resolving dualities that our self has, if that's not putting too fine a point on it. And here you might have to bear with me while I introduce an important sidebar, but it's key. In both Eastern and Western psychological and spiritual practices, the self, our personal self, is considered something that can stand between us, whomever we are, and enlightenment, or at least greater awareness. In other words, the self can be an obstacle. And I won't revisit this whole self issue here, but I've written about it almost endlessly in previous blogs and books. But a quick reminder might be this. Here in the West, there's some confusion about the nature of the self, to the degree that we are told, on the one hand, to always be ourself, to be true to ourself, and yet, on the other, never to be selfish. I'm not going to try to resolve that Western conundrum here, but I am pointing it out. On the other hand, in Eastern psychology, like Tibetan Buddhism, the self is defined as the sum total of all our attachments at any current moment. Our likes and dislikes, something that we have created ourselves and then identified with. A long and painful history for most of us. However, where we Westerners think of ourselves as a conscious being, me. The Buddhists do not see the self as a consciousness or living being, like we think we are, or like we are a living being. But they see it rather as a convenient personal assemblage, like a secretary, something that helps us organize our daily priorities, keep our appointments and so on, things like that. As mentioned, at least here in the West, most of us have personified ourselves as an independent being, as opposed to our actual nature, who we actually are. We even tend to see life, all of life, from the vantage point of the self. But this very same self is something that we've created, that we breathe life into. Now, I'm sorry if this sounds confusing, but it is. And obviously we could have a long discussion about this whole concept of the self, how we create it, and so on. But here I'm invoking this concept just to point out that dealing with this self that we all have, and resolving the duality between the self and the outside world, our self and the outside world, is something that each of us will have to do eventually, sooner or later. And because the self is nothing other than our own attachments, and by definition we're attached to our attachments, this can be tricky. And this is why maybe reverse psychology exists, of course, when we talk about the self. Sneaking up on yourself is kind of like sneaking up on a mirror. Every time you look, there you are. At least we habitually believe this is so, and act as if it's so. My takeaway point is just to let you know that the practice of Tong-Len has the quite marvelous side effect of gradually deconstructing the dependence on the self, but in a gentle and still very effective way. In other words, if we will practice Tong-Len throughout the day, as we go about our day, it can reduce our dependency and attachment to ourself just a bit at a time, and eventually rendering ourself as transparent enough so that we begin to see through to what's behind the self, which of course is our own mind, our own awareness, the same awareness that is aware or conscious sometimes of the self, of ourself, self-consciousness. In order for there to be something like self-consciousness, there has to be a vantage point or awareness that's not the self. That's the point. Otherwise, we could not be self-conscious. I hope that makes sense. Tong-Len practice allows us to transfer our identity gradually from our current preoccupation or identification as a self to the vantage point of simple awareness itself, the awareness that we, in fact, according to the Buddhists, are. And it's this awareness that will be leaving with us when we die, not the vantage point of the self like most of us tend or hope to believe now. So it's no wonder that we're afraid to die. We're totally attached to a self-concept that by definition is nothing more than something we've created, kind of a montage of our likes and dislikes, what we could call our personality. And it's going to eventually dissolve at death, just like mist on a summer day. And this point is a little bit of a big deal. Sooner or later, we each will be transferring our identity from this patchwork self to the pure awareness that we in truth are. This awareness being a vantage point that's actually portable, which the self is not. I can see, as usual, I'm getting long-winded here, so I'll have to continue this at another blog. I hope it's not too dense to be boring. If we can get on the same page here, perhaps I can show you how Tong-Len is such a brilliant and effective practice, and it's so easy to do.